Thank you very much for inviting me here today to speak on behalf of Concord. As we've touched upon already, in the Agenda 2030, migration is recognised as an important ingredient for development. But what we're seeing at the European level is that migration is increasingly framed in terms of security rather than human rights. The approach of linking external action to migration management became formalised in the partnership communication in June. And since then, all relationships with third countries, whether it's development, but also climate change, education, trade, you name it, all is to be leveraged and redirected to focus on migration management. As civil society, we strongly reacted to that proposal, and in a matter of a few days, over 140 NGOs from across Europe, development, humanitarian, migration, human rights organizations reacted and said, please, member states, just reject the communication. Clearly, member states didn't listen, but it was an important signal. In that wider foreign policy framework, we've seen a notable shift in the last year, whereby development cooperation is supposed to be directed to address the root causes of migration, implying that migration is a problem to be solved or a threat to be stopped. We don't think that's the case. Forced migration or forced displacement is something else than migration as a whole. And we are particularly concerned about how the EU, including the member states that is discussing how to use aid and trade as incentives, as a form of conditionality to work with partner countries on migration management. In the 3 progress reports so far on the partnerships, it's clear that development cooperation is being linked to cooperation on return and readmission. And particularly if countries do more, then the EU will give more. Member states are driving that very strongly behind the scene, and some member states, for example Austria, have explicitly made their development cooperation conditional on functioning readmission agreements. So it's really completely internally EU politically driven and not linked to the needs on the ground, not linked to an analysis of the situation. It also entails a strong focus on those countries which are important for out-migration to Europe, to the detriment of the rest of the world. And it disregards lessons learned from the past, because, for example, in the European neighbourhood policy, it was evaluated that the more for more approach did not work, that it was too coercive and it would not be repeated with the current neighbourhood policy. Now, in that political context, we happen to be at the midterm review of the MFF. So migration is one of the key lenses through which this midterm review will be looked at. And that risks putting aside years of inclusive negotiations on long-term development programming in favour of short-term migration control goals. Moreover, billions of euros that would normally go to mainstream EU development cooperation are now channeled into separate funding pots, the Emergency Trust Fund for Africa being one of them. And while the Trust Fund, now talking about the Africa Trust Fund, while it finances some genuine development programming, we remain unconvinced by the validity of the vision behind the trust funds. Because it's not about poverty eradication or humanitarian aid or human rights, it's really much rather on stemming migration flows. The current intel, for example, suggests that return indicators will be added to the trust fund projects. And a lot of funding goes to border management, etc. But this is ODA funded. In addition, the funding criteria to qualify for projects under the trust fund and the allocation process is not transparent, and the effectiveness of the trust funds and whether they actually respect the rules and the regulations of all these instruments that feed into the trust funds are respected, we don't know, because there hasn't been an evaluation. On top of these very fundamental questions, there's also the simple fact, which plenty of academics have already proven and we've already touched upon, that more development does not lead to less migration. If that were the case, why are there so many European experts? In addition to the Emergency Trust Fund for Africa, there are also substantial problems with the Emergency Facility for Turkey, with the proposed European Sustainable Development Fund, the proposed resettlement regulation. I won't go into detail on all these now, but suffice to say that all these instruments are now supposed to serve this migration control agenda and represent a diversion of funding from long-term development programming and away from the real objectives of EU development cooperation and humanitarian aid. Now, beyond the impact on development programming and funding, What's equally worrying to this picture, but often disregarded, is the wider geopolitical impact of this migration turn in the EU, or what I've started to call internally the EU's migration obsession. Take Libya, for example. It's a country in fully fledged conflict. There's not a functioning government, no control of the territory. Who can honestly look at that country today and think the biggest priority is to stop migration to Europe? I mean, what about stabilization, security, peace building? With 200 million euro put behind that communication on the central Mediterranean route, compared to 2 million for humanitarian aid, I think the prioritization is quite clear. Another example is Sudan. Whether it's via the Khartoum process or the trust fund spending, the EU is increasingly seeking to normalize its relations with the Sudanese government because it's a key transit country. In addition, EU funding will be given to the Sudanese authorities to enforce border control. Now, if you look at the report from GUE, one of the groups in the parliament who actually went on mission there, it's the rapid support forces that control the border between Sudan and Libya in the north. And that's in a group which are better known under the name Janjaweed and who are responsible for the atrocities in Darfur. So how far is the EU willing to go for this migration control agenda? A third and a last example is Mali. The EU would like to increase returns of Malians from Europe as part of the Compact's discussions. But what the EU is not taking into account is what a crucial lifeline these remittances are for Mali. As was mentioned before, it's 2 to 3 times as high as ODA, and in many ways in Mali, the remittances substitute for state services which are not there. So given the high level of unemployment and the fragility of the country, migration also offers a kind of a safety valve for young people that might otherwise pose a threat to stability. Now, of course, legal pathways to Europe could be opened instead, but we all know that's the last priority of EU member states. So what could be the effect of enforcing returns to Mali? What if the reduction in remittances and the resulting decline in economic activity create so much unrest that the country further implodes and actually more migration and forced displacement comes as a result? What if it leads to increased aid dependency? And what's the impact of all these enforced border controls in Africa on the ECOWAS freedom of movement? And a lot of open questions, I realise, but that brings me exactly to the point I was trying to make, is that the EU needs to think through the answers to these questions before embarking on new deals and new agreements and new policies. Where are the impact assessments? We have to stop this current trend of some heads of state wanting something to appease part of their constituencies and then EU experts being asked to make it legal and somehow implement it. So it's just not a way of working and it leads to bad policy. So what we're calling for as Concord is a binding commitment to a do no harm approach. Secondly, an impact assessment before any new policies or deals are embarked upon. Thirdly, consultation with the European Parliament. Fourthly, consultation with civil society, both in Europe and in the countries that we're discussing. And lastly, based on proper evidence, based on systematic data collection on the drivers of migration and along the migration route. Now, I know none of these 5 points is rocket science. It's simply good policy making. Now, don't get me wrong, NGOs are not against returns as such, as long as they're part of a broader migration strategy and that they happen with respect for human rights and in dignity. But there's a need for more consultation and for benchmarks of success for European migration policy, which goes beyond the number of people stopped. And none of this has anything to do with development cooperation. It's a home affairs agenda. Linking returns and restrictions on mobility to development cooperation is a major problem. It's a distortion of development cooperation. It does not focus on the poverty reduction, and it may even work counter to that purpose. And it undermines the development effective principles of alignment and ownership and the spirit of partnership that's supposed to be the basis of development cooperation. So I hope with that overview it has become clear why development NGOs are saying is what we've seen in the last year is a policy coherence for development in reverse. It's really using development funding and programming and foreign policy in the name of a migration control agenda. Instead, we want the Lisbon Treaty to be respected, as you were saying, and EU development cooperation should be focused on long-term poverty eradication and decreasing inequality. Thank you.